country music legend Naomi Judd, who died unexpectedly over the weekend. She was 76. Her death is shining light on the disease of mental illness, a battle Judd herself was very public about.
4 years have passed since country music lost one of its most beloved voices. Yet the silence from the man closest to Naomi Judd has always felt heavier than words could carry. Larry Strickland, her husband of 33 years, spent years stepping back from public view while the world processed a grief that his family knew most intimately. Then, in the spring of 2025, everything changed. Through a landmark Lifetime docuseries and candid interviews, Strickland finally opened up, and what he revealed left fans, journalists, and the wider world completely stunned. The man behind the legend, who Larry Strickland really is. Before the world knew Larry Strickland as Naomi Judd's devoted husband, he had already carved out a place in music history that most singers could spend an entire career chasing and never reach. Born in 1946 in Raleigh, North Carolina, as the son of a preacher, Strickland grew up immersed in the sound of gospel music from his earliest years. That upbringing planted something deep inside him, a love for sacred sound that would shape every professional decision he would ever make. He began pursuing gospel seriously after attending his first major concert at age 12. And from that point forward, music became both vocation and calling. His path toward professional singing did not unfold without interruption. Like many young men of his generation, Strickland served 4 years in the United States Army, working with the National Security Agency in Frankfurt, Germany, before returning home to resume his musical ambitions. That period of service gave him discipline and structure that would serve him well in the demanding world of professional touring. When he returned stateside, he resumed performing with gospel quartets across North Carolina, eventually drawing enough attention that his voice became impossible to overlook. The turning point came when he opened a show for J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet and caught Sumner's ear in a way that no other young singer had. Years later, when Richard Sturban departed the Stamps to join the Oak Ridge Boys, Strickland received the call, auditioned in Nashville, and landed the job. What followed was a chapter in his life that even he might not have dared to imagine. His first performance with the Stamps happened to be alongside Elvis Presley in Las Vegas. From that night forward, he was part of the inner circle surrounding the King, known as the TCB Band, performing at concert after concert across the country. Between 1975 and 1977, Strickland performed in over 204 concerts with Elvis Presley, contributing deep bass vocals to live performances and studio sessions, including Graceland's Jungle Room sessions. His voice can be heard on Way Down, one of the last known songs Elvis recorded during the Jungle Room sessions, a recording that connects him permanently to the final chapter of Presley's creative life. For gospel music lovers and Elvis historians alike, that contribution is not a footnote. It is a credential that stands entirely on its own merits. After Elvis died in August 1977, Strickland remained committed to gospel music, continuing to perform with the Stamps and other ensembles while also growing into music management and production. He had built a reputation as someone who understood not just how to sing, but how to support and elevate other artists. That sensibility would prove crucial when his personal and professional life shifted in a direction he could not have predicted. The Nashville music world that Strickland moved through in the 1980s was one where gospel backgrounds were respected and professional connections mattered as much as raw talent. He understood how the business worked, having seen its mechanics from the inside while traveling with one of the most successful touring operations in the history of American music. When he began working more closely with Naomi after their marriage, he brought that operational knowledge with him, functioning not just as her husband, but as a manager who understood the demands of professional performance at the highest level. In 1979, while Naomi Judd was working as a nurse in Nashville, their paths crossed and an immediate connection formed. Strickland's touring schedule kept him on the road frequently during those early years, which created real strain on the relationship. He has since acknowledged a period of infidelity during those times and expressed genuine regret over the hurt it caused. Despite those difficulties, both he and Naomi kept returning to one another, drawn together by something neither could fully explain or ignore. On May 6, 1989, the two married in a ceremony where Naomi's daughters, Ashley and Winona, stood as bridesmaids for their mother. It was a signal to the world that this was a full family. Strickland embraced both daughters as his own, and they, in turn, called him Dad. For over 3 decades, he stood as Naomi's husband, manager, creative collaborator, and ultimately her primary caregiver. That final role, which no one plans for and no one trains for, is at the heart of everything he has recently come forward to share. The private battles nobody knew about. Behind the rhinestones, the stadium concerts, and the Grammy Awards, a different story was unfolding inside the home Naomi Judd shared with Larry Strickland in Tennessee. It was a story of a woman at war with her own mind, and a husband who watched helplessly as she retreated further into darkness. The public version of Naomi Judd was electric, warm, funny, and radiant. The private version, especially in her later years, was struggling in ways that her most devoted fans would never have been able to reconcile with the performer they adored. Naomi Judd battled anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, and PTSD throughout her life, conditions confirmed through the official autopsy report released by the Williamson County, Tennessee Medical Examiner's Office following her death. Her struggles with mental health had deep roots. She herself spoke publicly about a difficult and at times traumatic childhood that left marks which no amount of fame or fortune could fully erase. When she stopped touring after her hepatitis C diagnosis in 1991, which forced the Judds to disband at the height of their commercial success, the loss of that professional structure and constant audience connection hit her harder than most people understood. The hepatitis C diagnosis was the trigger for a particularly brutal period in Naomi's mental health history. Being a nurse by training, she understood what the diagnosis meant in clinical terms, and she understood that her livelihood and her identity as a performer might never be recoverable. The Judds' farewell tour in 1991 became the industry's top-grossing tour of that year, which only amplified the tragedy of its necessity. Audiences came out in enormous numbers to say goodbye to something that had meant a great deal to them, and Naomi performed through every one of those shows, carrying a weight that her stage presence concealed from view. By the mid-1990s, her hepatitis C moved into remission, and she eventually returned to performing in various capacities. But the years away from the stage had changed her relationship with her own mental health in ways that medication and willpower alone could not fully address. The separation anxiety she described after Winona went solo was real and destabilizing. She found herself without the structure that touring had provided, without the daily purpose that performance had given her identity, and without the constant proximity to an audience whose love she had come to depend on deeply. In a 2016 interview, Naomi described the experience openly. She spoke of coming home from tours and not leaving the house for 3 weeks, not practicing basic hygiene, spending 2 years on her couch in a deep, dark, absolutely terrifying place. She also wrote honestly about her experience in her 2016 memoir, River of Time: My Descent into Depression and How I Emerged with Hope, which detailed treatment with medication and electroshock therapy and her tentative return toward stability. What Strickland has now described, with a candor that startled even longtime followers of the Judd family story, is what those years actually looked like from inside the home. He watched Naomi withdraw into the living room sofa, lying silently under blankets for hours at a time, for days at a time. He made it a rule never to leave the house without telling her exactly where he was going and exactly when he would return, because her anxiety required that constant reassurance. He tried to gently nudge her forward, encouraging small acts of normalcy that he hoped would interrupt the fog settling over her. In reflecting on those years, he has expressed something that sounds like both love and regret simultaneously. He admits that he may have been too focused on helping in the way he understood helping, and that perhaps what she needed was more space, more permission to move at her own pace rather than gentle pressure. That kind of honest self-examination from a man who devoted years of his life to her care sounds less like guilt and more like grief examined under a magnifying glass. Every decision turned over long after the moment to change it has passed. The months leading up to April 30th, 2022, were described by Strickland as very chaotic and hectic. Naomi had agreed to fly alone from Vienna, Austria to Nashville, Tennessee, for the Country Music Hall of Fame induction ceremony. The fact that she was traveling solo alarmed him deeply. He later said publicly that he was scared to death about her making that journey alone, because he knew how fragile she was at that point. She arrived safely, but the internal battle raging inside her during those final days was something no external precaution could contain. He has since revealed that a stranger on the plane struck up a conversation with Naomi during that flight. After her death, that stranger found a way to reach Strickland and wrote to him that life felt richer for having briefly met her, and that Naomi spoke warmly of him and of the life they had built together. The stranger wanted him to know that even in her final days, she was telling people how much she loved him. Strickland described receiving that message as giving him great pleasure and comfort, perhaps because it confirmed that even in darkness, something of her warmth and her love for him remained intact. The shocking revelations that left the world speechless. In May 2025, Lifetime aired a two-part documentary event titled The Judd Family, Truth Be Told, produced by Propagate Content and directed by Alexandra Dean. The 4-hour documentary featured exclusive interviews with Winona, Ashley, and Naomi's widower, Larry Strickland, alongside rare archival footage, unreleased songs, and voicemails the Judd women left for one another over the years. Reba McEntire and longtime Judd's collaborator Don Potter also appeared to speak about Naomi's legacy and impact. The series premiered on Mother's Day weekend, a choice in timing that felt both poetic and deliberately significant, given Naomi's role as the heart of a family defined by its mother-daughter relationships. Director Alexandra Dean noted that both Winona and Ashley took a considerable amount of time to agree to participate, wanting to be certain this would be the right representation of their mother's life. Both were concerned that her story be told with full complexity, fairness, and honesty, not as a sanitized tribute, but as a genuine reckoning with who Naomi Judd was in every dimension. What emerged was more revealing than almost anyone anticipated. Among the most talked about moments was a scene in which Strickland was shown footage from the 1995 biographical television film Love Can Build a Bridge, which dramatized events from Naomi's 1993 memoir of the same name. The scene depicted Naomi discovering that her husband had been unfaithful through repeated phone calls from another woman. In the film, the character based on Naomi responds by shooting a gun at her husband. When asked directly whether that scene reflected real events, Strickland gave an answer that was quiet, definitive, and impossible to walk back. He said, "Well, it really happened. That's all I can say. That's all I'm going to say. It happened." That confirmation sent shockwaves through the audience watching the documentary and through the broader entertainment media. The idea that one of country music's most celebrated couples had survived not just infidelity, but a literal confrontation involving a firearm fundamentally complicated the warm, devoted public image the two had maintained for decades. Yet what followed in the documentary was not a story of permanent rupture. It was a story of two people who chose, again and again, to stay. Whatever damage was done in those early years, both of them ultimately committed to rebuilding something together. And that rebuilt thing endured for over 3 decades. The documentary also surfaced other layers of complexity within the Judd family history. Naomi, born Diana Ellen Judd on January 11, 1946, in Ashland, Kentucky, had a difficult adolescence that included becoming pregnant with Winona at age 17. When she returned home from school one day to announce the pregnancy, her parents locked the front door. They did not speak to her until after Winona was born. That rejection at such a formative moment planted a wound that years of therapy, faith, and fame never fully healed. The documentary made clear that the generational trauma threaded through Naomi's life did not originate with her. It arrived before she was old enough to defend herself against it. The documentary also used unreleased audio recordings, family photographs, and actual voicemails exchanged between the Judd women. Hearing Naomi's unguarded voice in recordings captured outside of any performance context reminded viewers of the distance between a public persona and a private person. The warmth and humor that Strickland had always described in her came through in those recordings, but so did a fragility and searching quality that characterized someone who had survived remarkable pain and never entirely stopped feeling its weight. Ashley Judd spoke in the documentary about her final conversation with her mother on the morning of April 30, 2022. She described receiving texts from Naomi that read simply, "Please help." She arrived at the home to find her mother uncomfortable, pacing the kitchen, saying she did not want to be here anymore. At some point, Naomi calmed, and in that calmer moment, she spoke to Ashley about why she had continued to live despite her suffering, naming her daughters among the reasons. Then, later that morning, with Ashley still close by, Naomi used a firearm to take her own life. Ashley has described carrying both grief and trauma from discovering her mother, and her public statements suggest a weight that does not diminish with time. Strickland's decision to participate in this documentary, to sit before a camera and confirm painful truths about his marriage, his failures, and the impossible final chapter of his wife's life, was itself an act of courage. It was not the silence his representative had initially requested in the aftermath of Naomi's death in April 2022, when the family asked simply for privacy. This was something different and something larger. This was an accounting, offered not to rehabilitate his image or to control a narrative, but to give the world the full picture of a woman he clearly loved with considerable complexity and equal devotion. A life rebuilt, Larry Strickland. After Naomi. The house in Leiper's Fork, Tennessee, where Naomi Judd died on April 30, 2022, could not remain a home for Larry Strickland after she was gone. Some places become inseparable from their worst moments, and no amount of time spent inside those walls can make them feel habitable again. By the spring of 2023, Strickland sold the property and made a decision that surprised many people who knew him. He moved to Florida. The choice was not random. He and Naomi had spent time together in Florida during their marriage, often renting beach properties and escaping the Nashville world that carried so much of her public identity. The ocean had been something they shared in a quiet, private way. Returning to that landscape now on his own was not a retreat from memory, but perhaps a deliberate decision to remain in conversation with it. He bought a condo and has settled there permanently. He has spoken about walking along the shoreline and feeling her presence in the breeze and the waves, a sentiment that sounds more like devotion than denial. The question of what grief looks like for someone who was not just a spouse but a primary caregiver is one that rarely gets examined publicly. Strickland occupied both of those roles simultaneously for years before Naomi's death, and the shift from caregiver to widower involves a kind of double loss that the standard language of bereavement does not fully capture. He lost his wife, but he also lost the daily structure and purpose that caring for her had provided. The discipline of watching over someone, of making sure they know where you are and when you will return, does not disappear cleanly when the person you were protecting is gone. The grief of losing Naomi also brought him closer to her daughters in ways that may not have been possible during the complicated years before her death. Ashley and Winona have spoken about their relationship with Strickland with genuine warmth. and the family appears to have found in shared loss something that functions as shared purpose. The experience of becoming the surviving center of a family that had known so much public scrutiny seemed to sharpen everyone's sense of what actually matters. Strickland did not disappear into silence after relocating. In August 2023, he returned to the studio for the first time in years, collaborating with country artist Jillian Cardarelli on her single, "If I Could Talk to Elvis," a song that tied together two of the most significant figures in his own life story. He described the opportunity as unexpected and the experience as a natural fit. For a man who had spent years as Naomi's primary caregiver and then as her widower, the return to music represented something beyond nostalgia. It was evidence of continuity, a life that had not ended when hers did. His solo EP legacy, released in 2020, remains his most recent independent project, collecting gospel standards and country covers that reflect both his deepest roots and the wide arc of a musical life that few artists have lived with such range. He also appeared in 2023 alongside Naomi Judd and the Gaither Vocal Band in a tribute to Loretta Lynn titled "Coal Miner's Daughter," a celebration of the life and music of Loretta Lynn. The appearance was a reminder that Strickland's musical identity extends far beyond his association with any single person. His move to Florida was understood by those close to him as both a practical and deeply emotional decision. The Tennessee property carried memories too dense with the weight of what had happened there to be lived with daily. Florida offered continuation rather than escape. The beach walks he has spoken about, the sense of feeling her presence in the natural world around him, suggest a man who has not tried to seal off his grief, but to carry it with him into whatever life remains. The mental health advocacy work he has taken on since her death carries perhaps the greatest personal weight. In 2022, he appeared in the Academy of Country Music's digital series Lifting Lives Presents The Check-In, where he spoke openly about the emotional toll of caregiving, the nature of grief, and the importance of honest conversations about mental wellness. He has used his position as the person closest to Naomi during her final years to make the case that mental illness is real, serious, and deserving of the same compassion and care as any physical disease. That message, coming from a man who watched someone he loved suffer and die from its consequences, carries an authority that no press release or public campaign can manufacture. He has grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and those who know him describe a man who still has much to offer the world around him. What this story means for mental health and legacy. The story of Naomi Judd and Larry Strickland is many things at once. It is a love story that survived infidelity, professional pressure, severe mental illness, and 3 decades of public life. It is a family story about the ways generational trauma runs through parents and into children and into grandchildren before anyone has the language to name what is happening. It is a music story about one of the most commercially successful duos in the history of country music. But above everything else, it is increasingly understood as a story about what mental illness actually looks like inside a real family and why honest conversation about it matters beyond any single case. The Judds charted more than 20 singles on the Billboard Hot Country Songs charts, including 14 #1 hits, and won 5 Grammy Awards for Best Country Performance by a duo or group with vocal, alongside 9 Country Music Association awards. Naomi's voice, warmth, and presence were inseparable from the brand she and Winona built together across the 1980s and into the 1990s. The image of a mother and daughter in perfect harmony, both literally and figuratively, was powerful precisely because audiences wanted to believe it was complete. The reality, as the family has now made clear, was far more complicated and far more human. Ashley Judd's description of her mother's final morning as one in which Naomi texted the words, "Please help," cuts through every layer of public persona and lands in the raw center of what mental illness actually does to a person and to the people surrounding them. Strickland's admission that he was scared to death watching her travel alone because he knew how fragile she was describes the particular suffering of caregivers, the daily arithmetic of watching someone you love exist in pain while feeling unable to provide the solution they need. What Strickland has done by speaking, particularly through the Lifetime documentary, is to collapse the distance between the public understanding of Naomi Judd and the private reality of her last years. That collapse is uncomfortable but necessary. Mental illness ended the life of a person who had everything the world considers sufficient to be happy. Grammy Awards, a Hall of Fame induction, a devoted family, a husband who loved her, daughters who adored her, and a global audience who told her she mattered. None of it was a cure. That truth, delivered not through statistics or clinical frameworks, but through the first-hand testimony of the man who was present, is one of the most important things to emerge from this entire story. For those who follow mental health advocacy, the Judd family's willingness to name what happened and to speak about it in full complexity represents a significant act in the broader public conversation about mental illness. Ashley Judd's carefully chosen statement that Naomi died of the disease of mental illness was not simply a grammatical preference or a way of softening terrible news. It was a deliberate framing, one that attempted to shift the cultural conversation about self-inflicted death from the language of personal failure to the language of illness. That shift matters enormously. It affects how families grieve, how communities respond, and how individuals who are suffering privately decide whether to seek help or continue suffering in silence. Strickland's voice in this conversation carries a specific gravity because he is not an advocate or a campaigner by profession or training. He is a man who met Naomi Judd in Nashville in 1979 when she was working as a nurse, and he was coming off years of touring the country alongside Elvis Presley. He is a man who married her a decade later with her daughters as bridesmaids. He is a man who spent the final years of her life beside her on the couch, trying to coax her gently toward the light, making sure she always knew where he was going. He is a man who sold their shared home because the rooms were too full of what they had lost. When he speaks about mental illness, he does not speak as someone observing from a thoughtful distance. He speaks as someone who held on for as long as holding on was possible. 4 years after Naomi Judd's death on April 30th, 2022, the world is finally hearing what he has chosen to say. The revelations in the Lifetime documentary, the confirmation of long-rumored private events, the honest accounting of a marriage built on genuine love and genuine human failing, the portrait of a caregiver's devotion and a widower's grief, all of it lands differently than public relations statements or anniversary tributes. It lands like truth, told carefully and at considerable personal cost by a man who clearly believes that honesty, even painful honesty, is the greatest form of respect he can offer to Naomi Judd's memory and to the people who loved her. It is also worth noting what Strickland's silence over the first 2 years represented and why its ending matters so much now. Silence in the aftermath of a public death involving mental illness can itself send a message, one that families often intend as protection, but that the world sometimes reads as shame. When Larry Strickland eventually chose to speak, to confirm difficult facts and offer personal reflections on his own limitations as a caregiver and partner, he was choosing something braver than continued privacy. He was choosing to stand inside the full complexity of what happened and to say that love and failure and grief can all coexist inside the same story without canceling one another out. Naomi Judd spent her public life telling other people that they were seen and valued, that strangers deserved her time and attention, that a conversation with someone she had never met was worth 20 minutes on a toodwalk. That generosity of spirit is what made the stranger on that final plane flight reach out to her widower months after her death. It is what made millions of fans feel genuinely known by someone who had never personally met them. Larry Strickland, in choosing to speak honestly and at length about who she was and who they were together, is extending that same generosity back toward her memory. He is making sure she is seen fully, not just in the spotlight version, but in the complete, complicated, profoundly human one. It is not a simple story. It is not a comforting one, but it is honest. And honesty, in this case, is the most important gift he could offer to the memory of the woman he called his wife for 33 years, and to every person living quietly right now in the middle of something similar. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.